Shadows of Manderley, the haunting legacy of Rebecca. The Mediterranean sun beat down mercilessly on the promenade of Monte Carlo, its golden rays, a stark contrast to the darkness that would soon envelop the young woman's life. She stood there, a slim figure in a simple dress, her mousy brown hair ruffled by the sea breeze. At 21, she was still finding her place in the world. A paid companion to the overbearing Mrs. Van Hopper, feeling more like a shadow than a person in her own right. It was here, in this glittering playground of the rich and famous, that she first laid eyes on him, Maxim de Winter, tall, distinguished, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. He cut an imposing figure. At 42, he carried an air of worldly sophistication that both intimidated and fascinated the young woman. Their first meeting was a chance encounter, a moment that would alter the course of her life forever. Mrs. Van Hopper, ever the social climber, had maneuvered them into Maxim's company. But it was the young woman who caught his eye. Despite her shyness, there was something about her, a quiet strength, perhaps, or a depth of character that belied her youth, that intrigued him. Over the following days, as Mrs. Van Hopper was confined to her room with illness, Maxim and the young woman grew closer. They took drives along the winding coastal roads, picnicked in secluded coves, and talked for hours. She found herself opening up to him in a way she never had before, sharing her dreams, her fears, her longing for a life beyond the stifling confines of her current existence. Maxim, in turn, seemed to come alive in her company. The brooding demeanor that had initially struck her began to soften, revealing glimpses of a man capable of warmth and even playfulness. Yet there remained an air of mystery about him, a sense of some unspoken sorrow that she couldn't quite fathom. It was during one of their drives that Maxim first mentioned Manderley, his family estate in Cornwall. His voice took on a different quality when he spoke of it, a mixture of pride, nostalgia, and something else. Was it pain? The young woman listened enraptured as he described the grand house, the sweeping grounds, the rhododendrons that bloomed in a riot of color. She could almost see it, smell the sea air mingling with the scent of flowers, hear the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. But there was something Maxim didn't speak of, a subject that hung unmentioned between them. Like a specter, Rebecca, his late wife. The young woman knew only the barest facts: that Rebecca had died in a boating accident the previous year, that her death had been the reason for Maxim's extended stay in Monte Carlo. She sensed that there was more to the story, but her natural reticence prevented her from prying. As their time in Monte Carlo drew to a close, Maxim surprised her with a proposal of marriage. It came suddenly, almost brusquely, more of a statement than a question. "I'm asking you to marry me, you little fool," he said, his tone a mixture of affection and exasperation. Shocked, elated, and more than a little frightened, she accepted. The whirlwind that followed, the hasty wedding, the brief honeymoon in Italy, left her feeling as if she were living in a dream. It wasn't until they were on the road to Manderley that reality began to set in. As the car wound its way through the narrow Cornish lanes, the trees forming a green tunnel overhead, she felt a growing sense of trepidation. What awaited her at Manderley? Would she be able to live up to the role of Mrs. De Winter, to fill the shoes of the woman who had come before her? Nothing could have prepared her for her first sight of Manderley. As they rounded a bend in the drive, the house suddenly loomed before them, a grand, imposing structure of gray stone, its mullioned windows reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. It was beautiful, undoubtedly, but there was something almost overwhelming about its presence. as if the very stones were imbued with centuries of history and secrets. The new Mrs. De Winter's apprehension only grew as she entered the house. The great hall, with its flagstone floor and suits of armor standing sentinel, seemed to dwarf her. Everywhere she looked, she saw signs of a tasteful, assured hand. Rebecca's hand, she couldn't help but think. The flowers arranged just so, the furniture positioned to best advantage. Even the air seemed to hold a lingering scent that she imagined must have been Rebecca's perfume. And then there was Mrs. Danvers. The housekeeper appeared almost as if summoned by the young bride's thoughts of Rebecca, materializing out of the shadows of the hall, tall, gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed to look right through the new Mrs. De Winter. Mrs. Danvers was the very picture of foreboding. From the moment of their first meeting, the young woman sensed in Mrs. Danvers a barely concealed hostility, a resentment of her presence in Rebecca's domain. Those first weeks at Manderley were a time of adjustment and uncertainty for the new bride. She felt constantly out of place, a child playing at being the mistress of a great house. Simple tasks like ordering meals or arranging flowers became ordeals, each decision haunted by the specter of how Rebecca would have done things. She found herself constantly comparing herself to the image of Rebecca she was building in her mind. An image of a woman who was everything she was not: confident, sophisticated, beloved by all. Maxim, for his part, seemed to retreat into himself. Once they returned to Manderley. The man who had been so attentive in Monte Carlo now appeared distracted, often lost in thought. He spent long hours in his study or roaming the grounds alone. When they were together, there was a tension between them, a sense of things unsaid. The young Mrs. De Winter longed to bridge this gap, to understand what was troubling her husband. But she lacked the confidence to press him. It was during this time that she first ventured into the west wing of the house, the part that had been Rebecca's domain. Despite Mrs. Danvers' disapproval, she found herself drawn there, compelled by a morbid curiosity about the woman whose shadow seemed to loom over every aspect of life at Manderley. Rebecca's rooms were a revelation. Perfectly preserved, they spoke of a woman of exquisite tastes and refined sensibilities. The young Mrs. De Winter ran her fingers over the satiny fabric of the curtains, breathed in the lingering scent of expensive perfume, marveled at the array of silver-backed brushes and crystal bottles on the dressing table. Everything spoke of luxury, of a life lived confidently and to the fullest. It was here, surrounded by Rebecca's possessions, that Mrs. Danvers chose to make her first real assault on the new bride's fragile sense of belonging. The housekeeper appeared silently, startling the young woman. What followed was a calculated display of devotion to Rebecca's memory, with Mrs. Danvers lovingly describing her late mistress' beauty, her charm, her hold over everyone at Manderley. Each word was like a dagger to the heart of the new Mrs. De Winter, reinforcing her feelings of inadequacy and her growing conviction that she could never measure up to Rebecca's memory. As the days passed, the young woman found herself increasingly isolated. The staff, while polite, remained distant. The few neighbors who called seemed more curious about her, as Maxim's choice of a second wife, than interested in her as a person. Even Maxim himself seemed to grow more remote, his moods becoming increasingly unpredictable. The turning point came with the annual Manderley costume ball, a tradition begun by Rebecca. Eager to please Maxim and to prove herself capable of living up to Manderley's standards, the new Mrs. De Winter decided to keep her costume a secret, planning to surprise everyone. On Mrs. Danvers' suggestion, a suggestion that, in hindsight, was clearly malicious, she chose to replicate a costume from an old portrait in the gallery. The night of the ball arrived, and with nervous excitement, she made her grand entrance, only to be met with shocked silence. Maxim's face drained of color, and he ordered her to change immediately. It was only later that she learned the horrible truth. She had unknowingly copied the costume Rebecca had worn to the last ball before her death. This incident marked a turning point in her relationship with Manderley and with Maxim. The fragile confidence she had been building crumbled. She became convinced that Maxim was still in love with Rebecca, that she would forever be a poor substitute for his first wife. It was in this state of despair that Mrs. Danvers found her, standing at an open window in the west wing. What followed was perhaps the housekeeper's cruelest act, a speech so poisonous, so filled with venom and twisted devotion to Rebecca's memory, that it nearly drove the young woman to take her own life. Only a sudden commotion from outside, a flare signaling a ship in distress off the coast, broke the spell and saved her from making a terrible mistake. This incident, however, led to a series of events that would finally bring the truth about Rebecca to light. The sunken boat that was discovered in the cove turned out to be Rebecca's, and the body found inside was identified as hers. This revelation shattered the official story of Rebecca's death and forced Maxim to confess the truth to his new wife. In a moment of raw honesty, Maxim revealed the reality of his marriage to Rebecca. Far from the perfect union everyone believed it to be, it had been a nightmare of deception and cruelty. Rebecca, he explained, had been unfaithful from the start, flaunting her affairs and taunting Maxim with his inability to divorce her without causing a scandal. Her charm and beauty had been a mask for a nature that was fundamentally selfish and destructive. On the night of her death, Maxim confessed they had quarreled. Rebecca had goaded him with the news that she was pregnant with another man's child, threatening to pass it off as Maxim's heir. In a moment of blind rage, he had struck her, and she had fallen, hitting her head on a piece of ship's tackle. Believing he had killed her, Maxim had placed her body in her boat and sunk it in the cove. This confession changed everything for the young Mrs. De Winter. The Rebecca she had feared and envied crumbled away, replaced by a much darker figure. More importantly, she realized that Maxim's apparent coldness had been born not of comparison to Rebecca, but of fear that the truth would come out, fear that he would lose everything, including his new wife. With this new understanding came a shift in their relationship. For the first time, the young woman felt truly equal to Maxim, united with him against the lingering threat of Rebecca's legacy. Together, they faced the inquest into Rebecca's death, supporting each other through the ordeal. The inquest itself was a tense affair, with the local authorities pushing for a verdict of suicide. Jack Favel, Rebecca's cousin and lover, arrived to stir up trouble, hinting at foul play and threatening to expose Maxim. It was only through a combination of luck, quick thinking, and the unexpected testimony of Rebecca's doctor that disaster was averted. The doctor's revelation that Rebecca had been terminally ill and had likely engineered her own death to implicate Maxim provided a plausible alternative to murder. With the verdict of suicide confirmed, it seemed that the shadow of Rebecca might finally be lifting from Manderley. The young Mrs. De Winter, buoyed by her new understanding with Maxim and her growing confidence, began to truly settle into her role as mistress of the estate. She started to make changes, small at first, then more significant, putting her own stamp on the house and its routines. Mrs. Danvers, her power broken by the revelations about Rebecca, became a diminished presence. No longer able to weaponize Rebecca's memory, she retreated into the background, her devotion to her former mistress now tinged with disillusionment. Just as it seemed that happiness might finally be within reach for Maxim and his new wife, fate dealt one final, cruel blow. Returning to Manderley late one night after a day in London, they saw an ominous glow on the horizon. As they drew closer, their worst fears were confirmed. Manderley was ablaze, flames leaping from every window, consuming the house that had stood for centuries. In the chows of the fire, Mrs. Danvers was nowhere to be found. Had she, in a final act of devotion to Rebecca's memory, set the blaze herself, or had she perished in the flames, unable to bear the destruction of the world she had shared with her beloved mistress? The truth would never be known. As they stood watching Manderley burn, Maxim and his wife clung to each other, their faces illuminated by the inferno. In that moment, as the last physical reminders of Rebecca and the life she had led were reduced to ash, they felt a sense of both loss and liberation. Manderley, with all its beauty and all its ghosts, was gone. The future, uncertain as it was, lay before them. In the years that followed, as they built a new life away from the ruins of Manderley, the young woman often found her thoughts returning to that fateful night. She had entered Manderley as a girl, unsure of herself and her place in the world. She had left it as a woman, tempered by adversity and strengthened by love. Rebecca's shadow, once so overwhelming, had faded, yet she was not forgotten. She remained a part of their story, a reminder of the power of secrets and the strength required to overcome them. The lessons learned at Manderley about love, trust, and the courage to face the truth would stay with them always. And sometimes in her dreams, the second Mrs. De Winter would find herself once again walking the halls of Manderley, not as the timid bride she had been, but as the confident woman she had become. In these dreams, the house was not a place of fear and shadow, but a testament to growth and resilience. And always, always, she would awake to find Maxim beside her, their hands intertwined, the past laid to rest, and the future stretching out before them, full of possibility. As the years passed, the story of Manderley and its inhabitants took on an almost mythical quality. Whispers and rumors circulated in society circles, each retelling embellishing the tale further, but for Maxim and his wife, the truth was enough. A reminder of the battles they had fought and won together. They had emerged from the crucible of Manderley, changed their love, tested and proven strong. The shy girl who had once felt so out of place in the grand halls of the estate was now a woman of substance, confident in her own skin. Maxim, freed from the weight of his secrets, had rediscovered the man he had once been before Rebecca's poison had seeped into his life. Together they built a new life, one free from the shadows of the past. They traveled, they loved, they lived fully and deeply. And if sometimes, on misty mornings or stormy nights, their thoughts turned to a great house by the sea, consumed by flames, but eternal in memory, it was with a bittersweet nostalgia rather than regret, for in the end, Manderley had given them more than it had taken away. It had been the forge in which their love was tempered, the crucible, from which they had emerged stronger and more united. The ghost of Rebecca, once so potent, had faded to little more than a cautionary tale, a reminder of the power of truth and the enduring strength of love. And so, as they walked hand in hand into their future, Maxim and his wife carried with them the lessons of Manderley, that love can overcome even the darkest of pasts, that strength often comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes, from the ashes of what was lost, something even more beautiful can arise.